Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davidge. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, DeKalb County Public Library, and the DeKalb Library Foundation, welcome to another in our continuing series of virtual author programs. Tonight is a very special event, and I am actually sitting in a special space this evening. We're here in the Decatur Library, the home of the Georgia Center for the Book, and I am sitting in our periodicals room, which right now has been converted into an art gallery for the Book is Art 2021 exhibition. It is a beautiful exhibition of handmade books, transformed books, and printed and letterpress works. If you'd like to find out more about the Book is Art exhibition and all of our programs, we encourage you to go to the Georgia Center for the Book's website, georgiacenterforthebook.org. You can find us on Facebook, or you can find us on our Eventbrite page, and you can sign up for our forthcoming events. We'll go ahead and we'll put the link over there, and you can just click that, and it will take you directly to those so you can see the wonderful programs we have coming for you through the month of September. I'd also like to remind you this evening that our bookseller is Eagle Eye Bookshop here in Decatur. They're one of the many independent bookstores that we use when we do programming, and they have done such a wonderful job, like so many independent bookstores across the country have done for the past 18 months. During the pandemic, so many people were desperately trying to get books, new books, used books, games, and puzzles, and our independent bookstores really stepped up by mailing books to home, providing curbside pickup, and sometimes, like some of the stores here in Atlanta, they even did delivery to your doorstep. So we always encourage our participants to purchase from independent bookstores all over our nation, wherever you are, especially our Black-owned independent bookstores and businesses, because we truly want to build a diverse society and a diverse literary community. I'd also like to remind you that after our formal presentation, if you would like to ask any questions, please use the Q&A feature. You'll find the Q&A button located at the top or the bottom of your screen, and feel free to type in those questions so we can read them in order. We've also enabled live transcriptions for tonight, so if you're in need of that service, you will find the CC button also located at the top or the bottom of your screen, and if you click on that, you can resize the font to whatever size you desire for tonight. Like I mentioned before, this is a very special evening because this is actually the book birthday of the new and expanded edition of This Was Toscanini. And we are so very pleased to have Lucy Antek Johnson here, who has worked on this revised edition of this book that actually was her father's work. Samuel Antek, of course, was a violinist who in 1937 became the first violinist for the NBC Symphony, an orchestra created by RCA for the legendary conductor Arturo Toscanini. He was a member of the orchestra for all of its 17 years, but while continuing to play first violin for NBC, he became the musical director and conductor of the New Jersey Symphony, the associate conductor of the Chicago Symphony under Fritz Reiner. After inaugurating his distinctive Young People's Concert Series in New Jersey, Antek was named the director of an all young people's concerts of the Philadelphia Orchestra. He guest conducted the NBC Symphony, the Houston Symphony, and the Buffalo Philharmonic, among others. This Was Toscanini is his unique evaluation of the maestro, and the book was published posthumously. Our guest this evening is Samuel Antek's daughter, Lucy Antek Johnson. She was born and raised in New York City, and after studying music, fine art, and ballet, she was drawn into the world of television production and spent her entire career in the entertainment industry, working with producers such as Martin Sharman, Harry Belafonte, David Susskind, and others. When she moved to Los Angeles in 1978, she produced movies for television, then joined NBC as a network executive. She soon worked her way up to Senior Vice President of Daytime and Children's Programs for CBS, a position she held for 14 years. She paints, writes, and every so often gets up the nerve to sit at the piano and play a favorite Bach or Chopin prelude. Once again, we are so very welcome to have Lucy here this evening to talk about this fantastic work. Thank you so much for joining us, Lucy. How are you doing tonight?
Well, Joe, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to share this evening with everyone in Georgia. And I understand you've gone through a little bit of wet weather. We're lucky up here in Connecticut that it's been dry, but it's just a pleasure to share this book with you on this very special day, because today's the official publication day. So this will always be a special moment for me.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Well, I know in our conversations leading up to the event, I told you that the previous director, Bill Starr, in his office, he had a wonderful picture of Toscanini and a signed program from the maestro. So I always felt that when I walked into the office, Toscanini was always there staring at me when I walked through the door. So I feel this is right at home with the Georgia Center for the Book. But let's talk about why you chose to take your father's work and have a new and expanded edition brought back for us so we all can enjoy it once again. What was it like doing it, and what was your inspiration for it?
Well, first I'd like to just make sure we mention that the new and expanded version has a subtitle, The Maestro, My Father and Me, which now encompasses my recollections of that time, as well as my father's memoir. So even though it is my father's memoir, even exactly as he wrote it then, the new edition is expanded to include other new photographs and new written material by me. Did you want me to read a little from the beginning, from the prelude? And that kind of might answer your questions. And if you have another question after that, because it's all in there, and I will put my glasses on, and here we go.
Wonderful, thank you.
So these are selections from the opening, my opening introduction in the book. My father was only 29 when he was handpicked to be a first violinist in the NBC Symphony, an orchestra especially created for Arturo Toscanini, regarded as the greatest conductor of his time. He was, by modern standards, a rock star. My father's musical memoir, This Was Toscanini, is an intimate, behind-the-scenes portrait of the maestro and of his NBC orchestra, told from the unique perspective of a musician fortunate enough to play under Toscanini's legendary leadership for 17 years in hundreds of concerts, almost 1,000 rehearsals, and innumerable recording sessions. My father brings alive the work that made those memorable concerts possible. He shares stories about the maestro's particular approach to a score, his conducting style, and of course, his infamous moods. First published in 1963, my father's book remains the most comprehensive personal narrative about working with the maestro. It's a story about the passion and dedication it takes to make great music under the baton of a musical genius who was not only a force throughout his 20th century career, but who possessed an artistry and style that resonate even now, more than 65 years after his last concert. In 2017, it was the 150th anniversary of Toscanini's birthday. Harvey Sachs, who's a very eminent Toscanini biographer and music historian, he had just published a new biography called Toscanini, Musician of Conscience, and it got international acclaim. But to my delight, Harvey quoted passages from my father's book. I was so proud to see that Dad's writing was still relevant. Harvey's book inspired me to reread This Was Toscanini. I had not read it straight through since its original publication many decades before. And rereading my father's book convinced me that it deserved a renewed life. It was time to introduce his work to new generations of musicians, students, and classical music fans. My reading also inspired me to bring my father's own story into the spotlight. Who was Samuel Antek? What were his dreams, his choices, his challenges? Even though the memoir is first person on his part, he doesn't talk much about himself. As a child prodigy, soloist, and successful conductor in his own right, my father also had a story to tell. So it's now my turn to tell it, as well as to share my impressions of what it was like to grow up with such a dynamic father in a home where Toscanini made so great an impact. In 1950, Dad's heightened recognition as a violinist and conductor led a distinguished literary magazine to commission an article entitled Playing with the Maestro. It was so well received that Toscanini was heard to say, "He wrote very beautiful about me, very simpatico." High praise indeed. Dad was soon approached by a publisher to expand that story into a book, and here we are. For the next few years, in addition to the increased demands of his schedule and the surge of celebrity that went along with it, Dad filled reams of lined yellow pads and wore out boxes of number 2 pencils. My mother dutifully typed up each draft, and I, wanting to get into the act, helped her proofread the pages while Dad wrote and rewrote late into the night. Tragically, my father didn't live to write the final chapter. He collapsed and died of a heart attack in January 1958. He was only 49. I was only 12. This Was Toscanini was published posthumously a few years later, and sadly, my father never got to read the remarkable reviews or receive the overwhelming praise from his friends and colleagues, praise that he would have treasured. So I'm honored to return my father to center stage to tell his story about the maestro who made such a dazzling impression on him, on the audience, and on other players of the NBC Orchestra. I introduce each of the book's original chapters about Toscanini with reflections of my own, creating a richer portrait of Samuel Antek, our life together, and the illustrious era in which he flourished as a musician. This new and expanded edition is a tribute to 2 musicians whose paths fortuitously crossed and whose individual gifts inspired each of them in their lifelong quest to make beautiful music. Glasses off.
Oh, thank you, Lucy. That was absolutely wonderful and a great, great introduction to tonight. So just to let everybody at home know, we have a fantastic slideshow to show you. And as we sort of walk through the slideshow tonight, Lucy is going to give us some backstory, so some personal reflections that go along with it. So if you give me a second, we are going to do some screen sharing here, and we will go ahead and get into this tonight. And I hope you will enjoy this wonderful look into the book as well. So quickly here. So here's, of course, the cover of the new and expanded edition, including your subtitle, The Maestro, My Father and Me. And the first selection here is this wonderful program from one of the NBC Symphony Orchestra concerts. So Lucy, could you tell us a little bit about the NBC Symphony Orchestra and how it came to be, and then in particular what this particular program is printed on, because that's a fascinating story as well.
Well, this program is from the opening night, Christmas night, 1937. So it has a whole significance unto itself. The orchestra was created and devised by David Sarnoff, General Sarnoff, who was the chairman of the board of the RCA, which owned the NBC radio network. And he, in his desire to be an impresario and to bring culture to the audience, and probably to sell a few records, he decided to create an orchestra, and it would be called the NBC Symphony. And what was the crowning moment was when he was able to sign up Arturo Toscanini, who was then not only one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century, but at points he was the most famous man in the world, or one of the most famous men in the world. So it was quite a coup to have Toscanini join this endeavor. And each of the musicians was handpicked to come together. And this was the program from the first night, which was printed on silk, almost all the programs, because the radio shows were live, they were live broadcasts from Studio 8H at NBC, which might sound familiar to you from other programs. They were not printed on paper because the sound of the audience moving the programs would have interrupted the microphones. So the special events were on silk, but they could also have been printed on cork or cardboard, anything that did not make a rustling noise. So that's where this came to be. This sits on my piano here in Connecticut. So the orchestra, even though it had rehearsed with other conductors prior to Toscanini coming in for the first rehearsal, which is also a very memorable story, which my father tells in great detail about how nervous they were. This was the beginning of the 17 years until 1954.
Wonderful. Well, speaking of your piano and of course, how Toscanini made an impact on your home, there's this wonderful photograph of the maestro. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, this is obviously an autographed picture, and it has been sitting on my piano because the piano that's in my living room now is the same piano I grew up with in New York City. And this was always sitting atop the piano. It was very regal. And he was a huge presence in our home, even from this photograph and my father's work with him. So it says cordial remembrance of Arturo Toscanini. And it's like a beacon of excellence for me when I look at it.
Well, now we have in your presentation some great photos of the maestro himself. And I know in these sections of the book too, it's talking a lot about how famous Toscanini was and how people perceived him and what he was like in rehearsals and things like that. Do you have a few stories that you could share with us with these photos?
Well, sure. First, I'd like to say that these photos were taken by a man named Robert Hupka. Robert, at the time, was a radio engineer, which meant he was present at the rehearsals and at the recording sessions. And in secret, he took candid photographs of the maestro throughout the mid-1940s, a couple of thousand, I believe. And these were the photographs that were ultimately used in the first book that my mother and Robert put together after my dad died. And I have used many of them in this book because they're now iconic pictures of the maestro. They're portraits, they're beautiful portraits. But please understand they were all candid. And supposedly the maestro did not know they were being taken. I'm not sure that's true, but that's what I'm told. So what was the first part of your?
Oh, so, what was he like? I know, there's also a little bit about his background and his upbringing, but, what was he like to rehearse with and things like that?
Well, he was an utmost professional and as congenial and as accessible as he was off stage, because he loved to mingle with the players and talk to them. He could be sometimes a bit of a tyrant in the rehearsal hall. And never in the concert hall, never at the final performance. But he had such passion for the music and such understanding, and his standards for himself were so high that his tolerance level when something went awry, which could have been a slightly late entrance, or I doubt if anything was off key, but small things could set him off. And he was known to spout his Italian curses. Now, they weren't all dark and horrible curses. One was vergogna, which was his favorite, which became my favorite, which really just means shame. But he would speak Italian. He would throw Italian words in as he's conducting. And one of his favorites was cantare, sostenere, which means sing, sustain. That was his, as my father says, that was his battle cry. He felt the music, and he encouraged the the men at the time, there were only men in the orchestra, to play with their hearts, not their instruments. Very interesting concept. And he also believed very strongly in look to the score, look to the score. There he is looking at the score. He had an incredible memory. He had memorized 120 opera scores and over 400 symphonic works, but he always had the score next to him during rehearsal. And his, his reputation was that he was the greatest interpreter of a composer's creation. Now that can be fluid, but he was always striving to play what he heard in his head, which was what he believed was what the composer meant. And the players, although sometimes they were a little traumatized by his tantrum or his screaming, realized that it was in the service of making beautiful music, and that it was Toscanini's passion, his rage to master. It wasn't so much anger. It really wasn't about anger. It was frustration, because he wanted to hear a certain sound, and they rose to the occasion and played better than they had before because of his exacting demands. So it was a very interesting relationship, and they loved him. They loved him. They would call him affectionately the old man. That's in quotes. That was private among the players, but they adored him, and he highly respected them. There was no doubt about it.
Yeah, you can see in these photos, clearly how passionate he was, and such large and broad strokes with his baton as well. And there's a great photograph coming up too of Toscanini instructing.
He's a little angry. He's probably saying, you, maybe it's the clarinet, I can't tell. He heard something wrong. He stops everything. So I also wanted to show something where it's not just his face, where you see him in action with the other musicians. And once my father was in the line of fire, and it was in a Beethoven piece, the Leonore Overture, and there's a tricky sequence for the first violins, and they're supposed to play in unison, and something wasn't working. My father describes it very specifically in the book. And Toscanini stops everything, and he points to my father and he says, you play alone. And all of a sudden, everybody hushed, and everyone around my dad was so relieved that it wasn't them he had turned to. And my father had to play this particular sequence all by himself. And he says his hands were like wet sponges. He was so nervous, but he got through it. Oh, here's Toscanini in one of his rageful, expressive moments. But he got through it, and then Toscanini went, tutti, let's all play together, and on they went. He could be quite dramatic and quite theatrical. But as my father says, it was all in the service of making beautiful music. It wasn't to harm people. Oh, there he is. He would sing along too. So it could be screaming, it could be singing along. He's definitely emotional.
Well, and in this next one too, you almost see how much energy he exerted, mopping his brow here.
This was taken during a recording session, and these recording sessions, it was very interesting. In the early days, there was no stereo, there was no tape, there was no long playing records. They were 78s, and they had to time the pieces of the music to fit within the recording discs, which I believe were about 5 minutes. So they had to create stops in the symphony or whatever they were playing where they would stop. And then they would switch the discs and play. And it was very exhausting because, believe me, everything wasn't done in one take. Mm-hmm. And they would be quiet, and then the engineer would say, well, we need just one more. And so by the end of the day, this is what you would see. He was not a young man. I mean, he was 70 years old when he began the NBC Symphony, and he was 87 when he retired. So at this point, he's probably in his early 80s. And You have to be impressed with that.
Oh, absolutely. And here's sort of like the last one, the pensive pause. But so when he was in his 80s, let's talk about the last NBC Symphony concert, the April of 1954. Because there was a nice little story about him conducting Wagner's Tannhäuser Bacchanal.
Yes. That was on the program that night. It was going to be the last concert for the NBC Symphony, not necessarily for Toscanini in his life. And they had planned this program, and it was a live broadcast. And in the middle of playing the piece, he stops and he drops his hands, and no one knew what to do. The orchestra certainly didn't know what to do. The radio engineers who are putting out a live program, they really didn't know what to do. The audience at home was terribly confused. The audience in the studio was watching all this with fear and trepidation and confusion. And I think at that point, the radio engineers put on another piece from another concert just to fill the airtime. But within a few minutes, Toscanini regained his composure and in a slightly more fragile way, continued the piece and completed the piece and completed the program. But my father writes, now mind you, I found these notes in his handwritten notes in the archives. He hadn't officially written this, but I always imagined that his last chapter would be about the last concert, because he writes, and I found the notes, that when Toscanini walked off after the concert was finally over, he dropped his baton and he was just exhausted and probably had a little stroke. Probably. I'm not going to say that was for sure, but likely it had been a small stroke. And that was the last of his performing in public. Forever. He was 87.
Wow. Well, speaking of your father, now we have this wonderful picture of your father and the maestro backstage, it seems.
Yeah.
And when I looked at this before with you, I love the fact of how casual it is. It's definitely not staged. There's tissue, handkerchiefs stuffed in pockets, and it seems very collegial.
It was. And as I said, he was very accessible in these off moments, in the 5 or 10 minute breaks. The handkerchief, which is my dad's handkerchief, is the violinist always puts it on their shoulder when they're playing for the neck. But I don't know what they were talking about, but this was at rehearsal. This might have even been taken when they were on tour across America, but it was backstage. And my father at this point in their lives was already a conductor. And Toscanini had been very supportive and encouraging of my father's career. My father never had to give up his seat at NBC. He held both positions of conductor and violinist for 10 years. And there was a time when he goes to Toscanini and says, I really would love your advice. I'm conducting Verdi's Requiem for the New Jersey Symphony in a couple of weeks. And I know, the symphony had played it many times, and Toscanini in his career had played it many times. Maestro, would you give me some advice? And Maestro invites him to come to his home, which was a beautiful estate on the Hudson River up in Riverdale. Yeah. And that day was a very special day, which my father writes about, of a real genuine conversation about musicians and interpreting scores and how to interpret a score. And Toscanini's pulling out original Verdi manuscripts. He knew Verdi. We have to understand what century we're in. Toscanini's background was cello, and he played cello for Verdi when Verdi was conducting Otello. So he was friends with Verdi and friends with Puccini. You have to wrap your head around this. And, but as it turned out that afternoon, which I call my father's master class, a private master class, they had a wonderful conversation. And in the end, Toscanini says to him, I don't have to tell you anything about the record. You know, you've played it so many times, you know what you're doing. But it was a wonderful afternoon and a very revealing afternoon.
Well, now we have this wonderful section about your father coming up, and you know, and you've mentioned he was conducting at that point of it.
At this
now
point,
we can see
he's very young,
yeah. But you know, now we get to see, you know, truly, you know, what a prodigy and an outstanding musician he was. You know, and this one looks like a posed promotional portrait, and then a promotional poster.
right.
So
Yeah.
you know, I mean, he had a long and you know, storied history himself. You know, even before he was playing with the maestro.
Oh yeah, he was born in Chicago to parents who were emigres from Ukraine. They were not musical, and but at 6 years old, because I guess kids in school played instruments, his teachers recognized him as a very special talent, and even used the word prodigy. And they went to his parents and said, you can't ignore this, you must do something. And they scraped together to get him the best teachers in Chicago. And as an older teen, he then went to New York and studied with Leopold Auer, who was a very famous violin teacher, and got a fellowship to Juilliard. And if you, I don't know whether you can go back a slide, but that's when he was about 29, and the poster on the right is after a few of his concerts he had played in Town Hall. And this was right before he was picked to be a violinist in the NBC. So this is the beginning of that chapter. But he was already concertizing and had gotten his great reviews. And then he joined the NBC Symphony, and it started on a whole new journey. He had always dreamed of conducting, and he had conducted a few ensembles, but his dream was to conduct a major orchestra. And in 1947, he was 39, he was named the musical director and conductor of the New Jersey Symphony. And now you see pictures of him in action. And then as time went on, he really developed a lot of new elements for the New Jersey Symphony. Special for me was the children's concerts that he developed before Leonard Bernstein, I might have to add. He created interactive with the kids. They came from all over New Jersey on the weekends, standing room only. And sometimes I'd sit in the audience, sometimes I'd stand in the wings beaming, you know, with pride, and watch at the end how these kids would just flock around him. He was a very handsome, very charismatic, obviously talented man. And the formats that he had created kind of raised his profile, and he became a bit of a celebrity, which was just about when the magazine asked him to write an article about playing with the maestro, because he had this incredible combination of a background, and that's what started the book.
And he also conducted for the NBC Symphony Orchestra as well.
He was asked, and that was the best invitation of all, when Toscanini offered him two opportunities, and it's 1952, to be a guest conductor. Because, you know, the NBC Symphony played many concerts throughout the year. Toscanini conducted maybe more than half of them, but they had guest conductors for the others. And to get asked to do that was quite the feather in his cap. That sealed the deal in terms of his future, that he was given the nod by the maestro. So yes, it was very successful.
And then now, of course, we have this wonderful photo of your father, your mother, and someone else there looking maybe, a little, apprehensive.
Who
At
could that be?
Oh no, that's a great family shot. And then there's this wonderful picture as well.
Yeah, that's my favorite. That's a favorite. Uh, this was posed, obviously, and I believe, as I'm looking at the picture on the wall, I know we were at the piano at that point, and he was probably looking at a score or looking at something. So it warms my heart.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. But then we also have, another nice little comparison shot here of your father. Looks like he's done conducting and sweaty, and another budding conductor as well.
With those awful, awful bangs. Oh my God. Yes, I was, I don't know, 11, 12 maybe. But I also love this picture of my dad because he's coming off stage, he's beaming, he's sweating, his personality shows through. But there I am. Makes me
Oh
laugh.
yeah. Well, I mean, the photo of your father truly looks like like any musician that is just, exhausted but joyful of what they've produced.
Exactly, exactly.
So now we have, and this is talking about touring with Toscanini, this photo right here of the maestro somewhere on a train.
In America.
Yeah.
In 1950, they made a cross-country tour on a private train called the Toscanini Express, and they've just pulled into some town, I'm not sure which, but you can tell there are mountains, so it's probably out west. They played in 20 cities, 2 standing ovations, and enormous crowds. They filled arenas, at the time, 5,000, 10,000 people. That's a lot of people in cities that you don't always expect are going to respond. And they were very successful tour, and they went across country. And actually, some of their most successful concerts were in the South. And so he had a wonderful time, and he was very relaxed. Why? First of all, he was getting great response from the audience, but also these were not being recorded, and it was not live broadcasts. And it probably allowed him to be a little freer and more relaxed with the players and with the audience and with the music. So that was very successful.
So of course, the NBC Symphony concerts were, 37 to 54. So, we were also looking at the start of World War II. Hitler's rise in Germany in 36, and of course the war, at least for America, starting, from 1941 to 45. And, Toscanini, of course, Italian, and
he was a staunch anti-fascist, and he got in trouble many times. He refused to play anywhere where Hitler was now in charge. So he stopped performing in Germany and Austria and whatever else happened in the mid-30s. And even before that, when the fascists had come into power, he was very vocal against Mussolini and the tyrannical way that Mussolini was behaving, to the point that and Toscanini refused to play the fascist national anthem, which was called Giovinezza. And everyone was supposed to play that at the beginning of every public event, probably like we do the Star Spangled Banner. And he refused. He would not play it at his concerts. And after one concert, he was mobbed, attacked, and beaten by a fascistic mob who were saying, "You have defied Il Duce." So at that point, Toscanini said, "I am never conducting in Italy again until this regime falls." And he didn't. He conducted around the world. He conducted in the United States. He even went to Israel to conduct for a new orchestra with Jewish refugee musicians that then turned into the Israel Philharmonic, by the way. So he relocated to America in 1937 to start the NBC Symphony, but it was also a good way for him to leave Italy. And he moved his whole family, and it was a very hard move. It was very, very difficult. So in 1940, the symphony through RCA was invited to go on a South American tour. And at this point, Europe was at war, but America wasn't. But they were going to embark in waters and into countries that had a lot of Nazi sympathizers. And he would walk, I found my mother's journal of each day of that trip. And she said that he would walk the deck holding a cross, praying for the Allies. And that's probably what's in his pocket there in this picture. And on that trip, exactly June, I can't remember the date, they were on the high seas, and Italy had declared war on Great Britain and I believe France, and that sent him to his room. He didn't come out for 3 days. He was so depressed and so upset about what had happened to his dear Italy. And needless to say, the tour was a triumph, but it was very upsetting for him. He did go back in 1946 to conduct at La Scala after the war. So that's what that picture is.
Well, speaking of the Star-Spangled Banner, we do have an audio clip that you wanted to share this evening. Do you want to say something about it?
Yeah, I do. In 1943, this small piece you're going to see is from a concert he created in 1943 when Mussolini's regime fell, and he had to celebrate. He was in America, but he had to celebrate. And he made his own arrangement of Verdi's Hymn of Nations. The whole piece is like a half hour, and it included Jan Pierce, and it included a chorus of 100 and the NBC Symphony, and it was a thank you to the Allies and a thank you for hooray, Italy is free at last, free at last. So this clip, which is at the end of the whole concert, is of him conducting the Star-Spangled Banner. And I find it very emotional and very, very proud. He's just so proud of what he's done and able to do.
Excellent. Oh, that was absolutely wonderful. I want to check on here and see if we have any questions from the audience.
I want to say you can find clips of his concerts on YouTube, and if you want to see the whole Hymn of Nations concert, that's available on YouTube. It's about a half hour. It's a very interesting. It was a documentary, very interesting. I recommend.
Excellent. Yeah, well, you can honestly see Toscanini's passion with him playing that. I remember my college band director, Don Wilcox, when he was still director of bands at West Virginia University, wrote an arrangement of the Star Spangled Banner just for us to use. And I remember him saying it should always be a strident hymn. And we always seem to play it much better when he conducted it as well. You know, but we do have a couple questions from the audience. And they ask, can you elaborate on your father being the inspiration and the groundbreaker for Leonard Bernstein's Young People's Concerts years later?
Well, he didn't do that in order to break ground for somebody else, obviously. But he felt very strongly when he began the concerts and conducting the New Jersey Symphony, that the communities come together in more ways than they had been prior to his being the conductor. And he went out into the communities, whereas before they might have just been held in one concert hall. So he brought music to the people. And then his other idea was kids, obviously, kids, and introduce them to music. Now it could be John Philip Sousa, it could be Peter and the Wolf, it could be Leroy Anderson. It didn't have to be something heavily symphonic, but he helped them understand tempo and what each instrument did and a little bit about the composers. So he got kids involved in music at an early age, and they would clap, and you know, it was interactive. So it was never on television because it doesn't happen in those days yet, but that's how it began. They still have an Antek Award at the New Jersey Symphony, which is for people, a musician in the community who has done something special for music in the community. So I feel very proud about that.
Oh, absolutely. That's truly wonderful. And I do like that section of the book, you know, because when you think of children's concerts, you know, and just filling the concert hall with kids and then playing things like the syncopated clock or Peter and the Wolf.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, music that would definitely grab a child's attention easily and, you know, make them want to clap along and be engaged with music like that.
Right. That was his intention, and it worked. And he was invited by all these other orchestras to replicate the template. And then Eugene Ormandy, who was the conductor of Philadelphia at the time, invited him to be the head of all children's concerts in the Philadelphia Orchestra. And so.
Well, Lucy, this is truly such a special edition of the book because, you know, not only do we have the insights that your father had about the maestro, but, you know, we have your wonderful recollections as well, and you know, putting the family spin on it and really seeing the wonderful work your father did. It just truly makes this particular edition of it, I think, just all the more special. And as we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone that Eagle Eye Bookshop is our independent bookseller tonight, and you can order a copy from them as well. I thank you in advance for supporting our independent bookstores. And if you have any last minute questions that you'd like to get in before we close this evening, please do so, because we have one more special audio clip to send you out this evening. And it's actually one of my favorite pieces of music. And it's so fun to hear. And it's a great, I think, Toscanini staple, if I can say, you know.
That's true.
I always think of this sort of being a Toscanini piece, that it's, you know, he owns it as a conductor for some strange reason. But he always comes to mind first when I think of this. So,
Okay.
but let me go ahead and we will go ahead and start broadcasting this again. Hold on one moment while this boots up, everyone. And if you don't know what this is, I'm sure you will know as soon as you see the downbeat. Excellent. Well, I can't think of a better way to end tonight's program.
Yeah,
That,
it's very uplifting, isn't it?
truly, truly is. Well, thank you so very much for joining this evening, Lucy, and sharing with us. Of course, this was Toscanini, the maestro, my father, and me. Happy book birthday to you. And thank you for putting this back out into the world and sharing it with us and all these wonderful stories and putting your father's spin and your spin on this and really giving us a little more backstory into that. I think that's a wonderful and beautiful thing. Seeing it sort of like all in the round now as your father is a performer and as a conductor, and of course, as a family man and the influence that he had on you as well.
Well, thank you, Joe. It's just been a pleasure to do this with you. And I love how we got into the photographs and the stories and the music.
Music is always the key. It's one of those universal things. So I'm so very, very glad that we were able to do this with you this evening. And I'm so very glad that we were able to come into your homes and share this with you. Hopefully, one day soon, we will be back in the auditorium and doing programs live. But until then, we will keep doing our virtual program and broadcast for you. Thank you all so very much for joining this evening. We will see you all again very, very soon. Have a wonderful night.
Good night.